The Subcommittee on Energy and Minerals Resources will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess of the subcommittee at any time. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I ask unanimous consent that the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, be allowed to participate in today's hearing. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Thank you all for being here today to discuss a very important topic: this administration's failed energy policies. Today, we are specifically focused on the actions or lack thereof at the Bureau of Land Management and how those actions impact our nation's current and future energy and economic security. My colleagues have heard me discuss time and again the importance of developing the resources our country is blessed with under the best environmental and labor standards in the world. Unfortunately, this administration has set an anti-development anywhere but America agenda that is making us more dependent on our adversaries who do not share our concern for the environment or workforce. Beyond the blatant issues of outsourcing of resource development to hostile, polluting, and inhumane nations, these actions have severe consequences at home, too. According to the latest data from the Energy Information Administration, the average price per gallon of gasoline in my home state is $3.95 a gallon just last week. The average was $1.87 in Minnesota's 8th Congressional District the week President Biden took office. Ladies and gentlemen, it's President Biden that did this. Nationwide, the number of households receiving government help to pay energy costs rose by an estimated 1.3 million last winter alone to more than 6 million, the largest year-over-year increase since 2009. Last year, nearly 34% of American households reduced or skipped basic expenses to pay their energy bills. The constituents I represent and hardworking Americans across this country simply cannot afford to keep going down this path. The simple truth is we will continue to need conventional energy for the foreseeable future. According to the Energy Information Administration, global energy consumption is on track to grow by nearly 50% by 2050, and conventional energy sources like petroleum will remain the largest energy source over that time. While some of my colleagues want to take traditional fuels off the table, I believe we need to be adding sources of energy to the mix, including domestic oil and gas development. And all of the above energy strategy, and the best will rise to the top. If not, we will become more reliant on countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia. The Bureau of Land Management can play a large role in ensuring American energy security now and into the future. Unfortunately, under this administration, the BLM has repeatedly failed to answer America's call. The BLM has ignored the letter of law under the Mineral Leasing Act, which requires quarterly lease sales in eligible states and drilling permits, or APDs, be processed in 30 days. In its first 2 years, this administration leased fewer acres for oil and gas drilling offshore and on federal land than any other administration since World War II. In fiscal year 2022, the BLM approved an average of 233 drilling permits per month. In contrast, the BLM was approving nearly 400 drilling permits monthly in fiscal year 2020 under former President Trump. Even my Democratic colleagues think this has gone too far. In response to the Biden administration's anti-oil and gas agenda, they added language to their so-called Inflation Reduction Act that requires the BLM to hold oil and gas lease sales as a prerequisite for approving permits for wind power and solar power. Despite this direction from the Democratic colleagues in Congress, however, this administration continues their work to circumvent this mandate. Further, the BLM has failed to provide this committee with the information to conduct adequate oversight and has put forth numerous regulatory actions to stifle domestic energy development on federal lands. These include, but are not limited to, the so-called conservation and landscape health. This rule proposed this past spring, which aims to lock up lands through special designations and new conservation leases, which were not created by Congress. And a new regulation on onshore leasing for oil and gas, which significantly increases fees for operators, likely crushing small businesses, and introduces new preference criteria for onshore leasing, which could lock up thousands more acres of federal lands for leasing. Additionally, the BML has recently taken site-specific actions to block onshore oil and gas development. In early August, the BLM issued new environmental documents for 2 resource management plans in Colorado, which will lock up 1.6 million acres to future oil and gas leasing. And 2 weeks ago, this administration canceled 7 leases in the 1002 area of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, while also locking up 13 million acres in the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. This administration took similar action in my district, withdrawing over 225,504 acres in my home state of Minnesota, putting off limits the biggest copper nickel find in the world. Banned mining in northern Minnesota. Can you imagine that? These actions make clear that it is not a priority of this administration to keep America strong. They only wish to appease the radical left at the expense of the rest of America. Today, I look forward to a robust discussion on the impacts of these actions and how this administration's policies must change to meet the energy needs for our future. And I now yield to the ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Stauber, and thank you to our witness and also our later witnesses for being here today. This committee has a profound responsibility to mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis. We have the unique privilege of being the committee responsible for overseeing our nation's public lands and federal fossil fuel development. As it stands, nearly a quarter of the United States' current carbon pollution comes from fossil fuel production on federal lands and waters. The U.S. is responsible for more historic emissions than any other country in the world. We have a responsibility to lead in winding down use of fossil fuels, and that starts with production on federal lands. Failing to do something about these emissions would be a lost opportunity on a timeline that we cannot get back. As overwhelming as the climate crisis may feel, we can do something about it. In the face of this global existential challenge, communities are doing what they must. They are organizing. And around the world, mass movements of everyday people, frontline activists, organized labor, and others are coming together to demand a change. And their message is clear. It's time to stop the end of fossil fuels. Leaders in some parts of the world are listening. The UN General Assembly, which is also meeting this week in New York City, is focused explicitly on climate change this year. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called on countries to, quote, leave oil, coal, and gas in the ground where they belong. Countries like France, Spain, and Belize have all passed laws to end fossil fuel extraction, and yet the U.S. continues to approve new leases at record rates. Here in this committee, we're here to discuss that very topic, the federal onshore oil and gas program. The latest announcements from the administration on oil and gas are welcome steps in the right direction to help get our carbon pollution under control. In July, the Bureau of Land Management announced new proposed regulations to bring long overdue reforms to the oil and gas program. And earlier this month, the administration announced it would cancel the remaining oil and gas leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and protect 13 million acres of the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. These efforts did not happen overnight. For BLM's oil and gas rule, we have people to thank and communities across the country that are beginning to organize on an everyday, person-to-person level. And for the Alaska News, I want to give enormous credit to the young organizers who have tirelessly pushed the administration to do more to protect the Arctic. Of course, many of us were disappointed to see the administration approve the Willow Project, which will have significant impacts on the climate and on essential ecosystems. But it is the organizing of everyday people alongside Indigenous Alaskans affected first and foremost by development and on the front lines of the climate crisis that secured these other victories. Organizing amplifies the voices of people. It empowers individuals and communities to multiply their influence, to speak up, mobilize, and demand accountability from those in power. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this statement from the Gowitchin Steering Committee statement in support of the cancellation of the leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. My colleagues across the aisle will have a different view of the oil and gas program. They'll say that we need to drill more and more and give away more and more of our federal lands to no end to big oil to ensure so-called energy dominance. But the American people know that security will come when we create an equitable, clean energy economy that puts families and communities first and ends our reliance on a global extractive industry. Of course, we have a long way to go to create a just transition away from fossil fuels. But these recent victories are a lesson in the power of determined, unwavering advocacy. Thank you again to our witnesses, and I yield back.
Good morning, Chairman Stauber, Ranking Member Ocasio-Cortez, and members of the subcommittee. I am Michael Nett, the Bureau of Land Management Deputy Director for Operation. I am pleased to be here to provide testimony on the Bureau of Land Management's oil and gas program. As stewards for more land than any other federal agency, the BLM plays a critical role in managing our nation's natural resources on behalf of the American people. The passage of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976 provided the BLM with our multiple use and sustained yield mandate, under which the BLM manages approximately 245 million acres across the nation, located primarily in the 12 western states. In addition, the BLM is responsible for managing 700 million subsurface acreage. BLM-managed public lands provide energy for diverse sources that include both renewable and non-renewable sources. The BLM manages the federal onshore oil and gas program with the goal of safe, balanced, and responsible energy development. The BLM currently manages over 34,000 federal oil and gas leases, covering 23.7 million acres, nearly half of the acreage in producing, with roughly 89,000 wells. The other half, over 11 million acres, are non-producing. In fiscal year 2022, federal onshore oil and gas development provided over $7.61 billion in revenue. Since 2021, the BLM has approved over 9,500 applications for permit to drill. The BLM's current oil and gas regulation were last updated in 1988 and contains physical terms that were set more than 70 years ago. The Biden-Harris administration made it a priority to reform the federal onshore oil and gas program to ensure that it's operating in the best interest of the American people. Following an extensive review, the department released its report on the federal oil and gas leasing program, identifying necessary reforms to the fiscal terms, leasing process, and remediation requirements related to the federal oil and gas program. Many of these recommendations responded to issues identified by the GAO and the department's Inspector General. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act provided once-in-a-generation investment in public land. The bill provided funding to address legacy pollution from oil and gas development. On the IRA, Congress coupled the development of renewable energy to the leasing of oil and gas and directed several fiscal reforms, including increased royalty rates for new leases and minimum rental rates. In July, the BLM announced its proposed onshore oil and gas leasing rule to modernize the program, codify new provisions from the IRN bill, and help implement the reforms agenda laid out in the department's report on the program updated in the proposed rule, including increasing the minimum lease bond requirement and focusing agency resources in areas with the highest development potential. Regarding oil and gas development in Alaska, the Biden-Harris administration recently announced steps to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and more than 13 million acres in the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. In the Arctic Refuge, Secretary Hyland canceled 7 oil and gas leases issued by the previous administration. In the NPRA, the BLM is proposing a new rule to govern the management of surface resources and special areas. The proposed rule would help assure maximum protection of significant resources, values, and enhance access to subsistence activities. As we transition to a clean economy, the BLM is in a unique position to help achieve the administration's climate and economic goals through science-based, balanced management of public lands. It is essential that the BLM oil and gas management promotes the highest industry and environmental standards while securing a fair return for the American taxpayer. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We're now going to recognize members for 5 minutes of questions, and I will begin by recognizing myself. Deputy Director Ned, was there any engagement with the leadership of the Alaska North Slope communities, the Native corporations, or tribal leadership, the individuals who live in the region, before making a decision to revoke ANWR leases or lock up 13 million acres in the NPRA?
Mr. Chairman, it's my understanding that there have been engagement, ongoing engagement, dating back many years, and that engagement continued through the Secretary's decision.
I beg to differ. I don't believe all people were consulted. In fact, many of them found out through the newspaper. Through a newspaper when it affected their livelihood and their economy and their way of life. I respectfully, Mr. Ned, respectfully disagree with your answer. The White House's national strategy for the Arctic region says under Pillar 3, quote, "We will also work with allies and partners to expand high-standard investment and sustainable development across the Arctic region." Do you believe, Mr. Ned, this administration's recent decisions are in line with that strategy?
Congressman, what I can say is that the administration is carefully looking at a careful balance of how to develop in the Arctic National Refuge, and after looking at the previous issue and the legal deficiencies in that analysis, decided to do supplemental. I believe again the intent is to do a supplemental and comply with the law.
You said legal. Is it customary for the BLM to remove leases without litigation?
There have been cases where leases has been removed. I don't know when you say customary what you mean, Congressman, but they have leases that have been removed without litigation.
And where were they?
I can't get back with specific, but I know in the lower 48, so for my 12 years of being a part of this program, 18 years of being a part of this program, that's happened.
So is it customary in the BLM to remove leases without somebody putting some forth a litigation? I think it's not, right? Would you agree that it's not?
Again, over my 18 years in this program, leases has been removed where there was no litigation.
Is it your personal opinion that the Bureau of Land Management agency officials did shoddy work in preparing the EIS for the ANWR leases?
I am sorry, Congressman, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Is it your personal opinion that the Bureau of Land Management agency officials did shoddy work in preparing the EIS for the ANWR leases? I'm trying to get why you canceled them.
I can say again, there were there were legal fundamental issues with preparing the analysis, and so the agency's taken a second look at that.
I want to make sure I understood you. You're saying that the agency itself, the BLM who did the EIS, didn't do the proper work, so you or this administration revoked the leases? Is that what you just said?
What I'm saying, Congressman, is after a thorough review, the conclusion was there were legal fundamental issues that required the agency to do additional analysis.
Did you work with the tribal communities?
It is my understanding, again, that throughout the entire process, communities were involved. As I sit here today, Congressman, I cannot give you the names of everyone.
Sure. No, I understand that, Mr. Ned, but I will tell you, in the last 2 weeks since this disastrous decision, we've had people in our offices, our Native community in Alaska, they're not happy. I don't believe that you consulted with them because they told me you didn't. When a community finds out through a newspaper that their livelihood was taken away, I don't think that's the appropriate way to do consultation in a press release, letting them know. I would just say, Mr. Ned, I do appreciate you and all that you have done at the BLM. And I appreciate your testimony today, coming here and taking these questions. You are a professional. And I will now turn it over to the ranking member for questions.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Mr. Ned, as you know, President Biden has set a goal to reduce greenhouse emissions by at least 50% and achieve zero carbon electric power in our system by 2035. And as the manager of 1 in 10 acres of land in the United States, the Bureau of Land Management has and will continue to have a significant role to play in reaching these goals. Oil and gas production right now is at an all-time high under the Biden administration, even higher than the Trump administration. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about what BLM is doing to ramp down emissions from public lands.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We continue to take a very thorough look and analysis for emissions. We're not only doing it by project, but we're looking at the cumulative impact. We're also looking at what's going on in downstream. So every project is going through a very thorough analysis. In 2021, the department undertook an assessment based on previous issued lease and is now applying some of that assessment as we move forward.
And I want to ask about some of the downstream effects of developing something like the Willow Project, which many Americans were disappointed to see moving forward given the overwhelming grassroots opposition and devastating climate impacts that Willow entails. Considering President Biden's climate goals, how is BLM planning to factor in downstream emissions of potential development into decision-making, specifically for its upcoming 2024 and 2023 lease sales and long-term planning? How is this different from how BLM has historically factored in downstream emissions?
Yes, clearly there have been a number of court cases that has helped to shape to our thinking. And so again, looking very thoroughly, looking on a project-by-project basis, ensuring we understand the impact, and then carefully working to put measures in place to minimize those impacts.
And when would the oil and gas leases have come online in the Arctic Refuge had the Biden administration not recently canceled them?
I'm sorry, Congressman, what was the question?
The oil and gas leases in the Arctic Refuge that the Biden administration just recently canceled, if the Biden administration had not canceled them, when would they have otherwise come online?
Oh, Congresswoman, they would have taken many, many years. The Arctic is a very complex place to develop, and it would have taken many, many years.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point to raise because we've heard arguments from folks on the other side of the aisle and in the oil and gas industry that the Biden-Harris administration's decisions in the Arctic Refuge and the Western Arctic will increase prices at the pump for many Americans. But just as you said, these leases wouldn't have even come online for many, many years from now, correct?
That is correct.
And even if all goes according to company plan, and those companies are interested in even developing in the area, which was questionable already in the Arctic Refuge, it would take a better part of a decade to produce oil and gas on approved projects in the North Slope. And according to project documents, the Willow Oil Project in the Western Arctic, which has already been approved, will not produce payable quantities of oil for at least another 6 years. Moreover, the supplemental environmental impact study for the Arctic Refuge Oil Leasing Program indicates that the earliest that the oil production could come online is 2032. And that's largely due to the remoteness of the coastal plain and the associated lack of prior exploration and infrastructure. So, Mr. Ned, what then would you tell some of my colleagues here and their industry allies who say that the administration's recent decisions are somehow going to affect gas prices now?
Yeah, I would say gas prices is primarily affected by industry and a number of factors. Those factors depend again on where energy will be developed, when it will come online. Those factors are beyond the Bureau of Land Management control. And by the way, the federal lands produce a small amount, 14% in oil and about 8% in gas, that contribute to the nation's energy need.
And what do you make of this argument that we can simply drill our way to lower gas prices, that we can just drill and extract on federal and public lands, and somehow that's going to lower our fossil fuel prices?
Yeah, the administration has been clear that as we transition to a clean energy economy, we have to look at multiple resources, both renewable and non-renewable, and we cannot continue to depend on one source of energy. And so I think the administration has been clear about looking for those options or multiple sources.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think my friend and colleague from New York just made a perfect argument for permitting reform. Mr. John Curtis, you're up for 5 minutes from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Deputy Director Ned. Great to have you here. Whenever I meet somebody in D.C. with BLM, I like to call out my local BLM folks and let you know how good they are, how in tune they are with the local needs. My district is unique. In the rural part of my district, which is the vast majority of my district, 90% of all land is federally owned. BLM is about half of that, so you can imagine it's a significant impact in my district. I'd like to just noodle a little bit on your comment that at BLM you're trying to so you can help me say exactly how they said this. You're trying to reduce emissions and trying to make decisions that reduce emissions. Did I catch that correctly?
I think I think that's fair.
Yeah. I'm curious how you decide that, who decides that, and what is the criteria for whether or not a use of your land reduces emissions?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. I think it's a combination of factors. And so normally when we're leading up to a lease, we're looking at the impact. Again, the cumulative impact. We're trying to put processes or terms in place to help manage that. Once we've issued a lease, it's the operator who helps with that by beginning with a minimization plan, a waste minimization plan,
So
as they begin to develop.
For instance, if it's a wind project that you're looking at, how far, you mentioned downstream, how far upstream do you go into the creation of carbon for those windmills? Is that part of the consideration?
With a wind project, it is part of the consideration. In terms of the specific, it would depend on the project. It depends where it's at and what is developed, non-developed, yes.
Let's turn to fossil fuels for a minute. I often hear something that I don't think is scientifically correct, and that is that fossil fuels cause climate change. My understanding of the science is that emissions cause climate change and not fossil fuels. Is that something you can wrap your arms around?
Well, Congressman, what I will say is there are many factors that is impacting climate change. I am not a scientist. I am no expert in it, so I will leave it to the scientists to determine that.
That sounds like a pretty good political answer. Let me just set forward that I think this overall branding of fossil fuels doesn't follow the science. The science is that it's the emissions. As you know, fossil fuels, depending on the type and how they're used, have varying amounts of emissions from them. I've personally seen a natural gas plant with 0 emissions. It's a closed loop. And so I'm curious, as you evaluate fossil fuels, how are you determining the emissions based upon the fossil fuels' impact on climate change?
Yes, so Congressman, the good thing is there's lots of data available on the uses, there's lots of data available on the impacts, and so our analysts, they're looking at that information to determine what is the size of the projects and how it will impact.
So, okay, but how do they take into consideration, for instance, if let's go to natural gas, if that natural gas is being used to replace Russian natural gas, we're producing it 40% cleaner. So there would be a dramatic reduction of greenhouse gas emissions with the use of that natural gas. Is that correct?
Let me say,
And,
that
well,
is
let me not ask you, because I know you're going to give me the political answer, but is that factor taken into consideration that you could actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions with that natural gas? And let me point out by starting that the U.S. has reduced more greenhouse gas emissions than many of our greenhouse reducing countries combined by the use of natural gas. So are we taking that into consideration when you're making these decisions?
yeah, Congressman, what I would say, we take a range of factor into consideration, and this specific you're giving me, I'm not familiar with it. I haven't done one like that, so I cannot speak to that directly, but we do take many factors into consideration.
I hope that that's part of it, because I think if we're going to have a thoughtful conversation about reducing emissions, we need to look at worldwide emissions and the fact that fossil fuels have actually been used, I know, shocker, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions around the world. I'm out of time, but I would love to have this further discussion with you to make sure we're making good decisions. I agree that we want to be clean and we want to reduce emissions, but I think sometimes we let our biases get in the way of how to best do that. Thank you, Chairman. I yield my time.
Thank you very much. Next up, Representative Lee from Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Stauber and Ranking Member, for having this hearing. I want to thank Mr. Ned for being here. And I want to acknowledge and meet my Republican friends halfway in emphasizing that I fully agree that our federal onshore oil and gas program has been mismanaged. But I also want to correct the record. It's been mismanaged for decades. And this administration is in reality taking steps that are long overdue in fixing this historic mismanagement with the proposed BLM oil and gas rule. In December of 2019, the GAO, at Congress's request, began conducting a performance audit of the federal onshore oil and gas program over the course of the last decade, and they released their findings in November 21. I'd like to ask any of my Republican colleagues, do you know which state was home to more land nominated for oil and gas leasing than any other? I'll answer it for you. My home state of Nevada, by a very, very long shot. From 2009 through 2019, more than 2/3 of the total acreage nominated for onshore oil and gas leasing was in my state, home to about 61 million of the roughly 87 million acres nominated nationwide. And adding insult to injury, only 3.5 million acres, or about 5%, were ever leased. The bulk of this land instead is left to languish, unprotected for conservation, or unimproved for clean energy or outdoor recreation. But wait, there's more. Complementing GAO's investigation on this front, the Taxpayers for Common Sense recently did their own deep dive into the federal onshore oil and gas program. And once again, I'd like to ask, would anyone know or be able to guess what percentage of oil and gas leases issued in Nevada since the 1950s have ever actually produced oil or gas? Again, I'll help you with that answer. It is 0.3% since 1953, or 72 out of 22,000 141 leases issued in the last 70 years. Not 3%, not 30%, 0.3% producing leasings. These findings make it painfully clear that Nevadans are not getting anywhere close to a good return on investment with this program as it exists, nor are the American taxpayers who have lost $34 million from outdated and below market leasing terms in Nevada just in the last decade alone. Many of my Republican colleagues on this committee self-identify as Theodore Roosevelt conservationists. That organization, the organization that today bears his name, the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, has come out strongly in favor of BLM's proposed oil and gas rule, explaining that the proposal will steer oil and gas development towards lands with existing infrastructure or high production potential, ensuring taxpayers receive a fair share of return on that development while reducing conflict between energy development and our sporting traditions. My bill, the End Speculative Oil and Gas Leasing Act, would go even further and give this energy and taxpayer-friendly approach the force of law. Deputy Director Ned, 3 very quick questions. How many bids did BLM receive for your most recent oil and gas lease sale in Nevada this July?
Congresswoman, it's my understanding, 0.
Correct. Did this lease sale nonetheless require your already overburdened and understaffed agency to devote taxpayer resources and staff time to prepare for it?
Yes, it did.
And I'm going to close with a question I've unfortunately had to ask more than once this Congress. Is it fair to say that America's taxpayers and public lands both stand to benefit from BLM rulemaking and bipartisan policymaking that shifts focus away from speculative and unproductive leasing in places like my home state of Nevada and toward non-sensitive places with a high likelihood of actually finding and harnessing significant energy resources?
That is the intent of the rule, Congresswoman.
Thank you. And with that, I yield.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the full committee chair, Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman Stauber, Mr. Ned. Good morning. Good to see you. Thank you for holding this hearing. And I didn't know there was so much oil and gas exploration in Nevada. I do know there's a lot of mineral exploration, and it's hard to get a permit to do mining there as well. And Nevada is obviously blessed with a lot of mineral resources that would be critical to developing any kind of green infrastructure, unless we wanted to continue sending money to communist China, who's commanding the production of minerals and elements around the world. But I've got more of a procedural question, Mr. Ned. Do you plan to follow the changes made to NEPA in the Fiscal Responsibility Act?
Yes, Congressman.
So what is the Bureau doing to ensure that EISs are approved in 2 years and EAs are approved in 1 year?
As we prepare those documents, certainly intend to follow the law and looking to see how we can add adequate resources and take the appropriate steps.
So do you have a timeline? Are you going to be, you have EAs and EISs that are over the 2-year mark that you're working to get them approved immediately?
Congressman, I don't have a list with me here, but again, looking at those EIS and those EA and
Just give me a couple of examples. Maybe not a list, but tell me a couple of examples of languishing permits that you're working on to make sure they're approved as soon as possible.
Well, again, there's a number of them in the hopper right now. And
Can you list one of them?
well, again, we have the Rock Spring EIS that has been going on way before this legislation was passed, but we're working, again, it's out in draft, and we're working to move that as expeditiously as we can.
I was in New York City yesterday dealing with the Park Service, and they want to build a migrant camp on national park land. And they basically said they're waiving NEPA, don't need NEPA to build the migrant center. So it's amazing to me how when there's one objective, NEPA's really important. When there's another objective, it's really not that big of an issue. But also 2 weeks ago, the department revoked 7 leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which will push back the production in AMWR. And I guess you're speaking on behalf of the administration, would you rather us develop oil and gas in AMWR or overseas in countries like Saudi Arabia or Russia, or just not develop it at all?
I believe the administration position is to transition to a clean energy economy and look at both renewable and non-renewable sources.
Can you tell me how much the consumption of oil and gas and coal has decreased globally under this administration?
I cannot speak to the global number, Congressman, and we'd be glad to get back
Can you
with you.
tell me how much U.S. coal, oil, and gas has decreased under this administration?
Well, I don't know if it's what we said decrease. What I will say, it's a less than 2%. I think when we look at some of the numbers, we're producing about 8.8% of gas from the federal land and about 14% in oil. And I don't have those numbers in my head from previous years.
One number that I saw just recently was that globally, there was a new record set for the consumption of coal. 10.4 tetrawatt hours of electricity were produced from coal globally. So the point I'm making is, as much as this administration pushes back, as much as the agencies push back and fail to help U.S. producers produce the energy here, it's doing absolutely nothing to slow down production and consumption around the world. It's just shifting it to areas that do it less safe, less clean, and with not near as much oversight and regulation as we have here in the U.S. The BLM's recent onshore oil and gas proposed rule would significantly change bonding for oil and gas on federal lands. However, according to your own statistics, there are only 37 orphaned wells on BLM lands, and the BLM's only called in bonds on 40 wells over the last decade. The data seems to show that BLM is doing a good job preventing orphaned wells currently, so why is the department proposing such a radical change that will be devastating for small businesses?
Yeah, Congressman, what I can say, the GAO has done a number of reports that clearly show that the BLM's bonding or the nation's bonding program was a risk to the American taxpayer, and they strongly suggest we looked at how to up those bonds so when we do have an orphan well, the taxpayer does not leave holding the bag. And so we're looking at those bonds that has not been adjusted for years and adjusted for inflation. We're proposing in the rule, and it's just a proposal right now, to raise those bonds so the American taxpayer doesn't have to pay for those.
Do you think 37 orphaned wells across the BLM is a dramatic number?
Again, 37 orphan well that have thousands of idle wells that, again, if proactively, instead of BLM has been working proactively to ensure that idle wells doesn't become orphan well, but when they do, ensuring there's bonds so the American taxpayer doesn't have to pay that bill.
I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll now recognize Representative Tiffany from the great state of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The representative of Nevada, I think, brings up a really good example of, in regards to leases. They should be spread out through more of the country. You shouldn't bear all of the burden. I think there's more of the western states where we have the dominance of the federal land that we should be leasing there also. I think you bring up a really good point, and I hope that happens with the Bureau of Land Management. Representative Curtis asked about emissions. Are emissions driving climate change?
Congressman, I will say emissions is helping to impact. As I sit here today, I cannot speak to what it's driving it.
Yeah, you said that you're not a scientist and you don't know, but that's what the administration is doing, is they're using this rationale of climate change or the green fantasy to try to drive their policy decisions. Do you agree that emissions from climate change are what, that it is actually causing the climate to change?
What I agree is emissions are having a significant impact on the climate change, and with the factors that goes along, it is a big impact.
So if we're reducing the amount of emissions compared to other countries, shouldn't we be producing these energy products right in our country?
I think what I will speak for here is trying to transition to that clean energy economy and ensuring we look at both renewable and non-renewable and using our public lands to help that.
Are you prepared to lead the charge in issuing more mining permits to be able to produce the gold, silver, and all the other minerals that are needed for what they call the quote-unquote clean energy economy, which is based on wind and solar? Are you prepared to issue a lot more mining permits on federal lands?
I believe we're prepared to issue permits that is on the lands that is appropriate for that development, recognizing again the multiple use of the land and the impacts from the various resources or the impacts to the various resources.
The key term there, Mr. Chairman, was appropriate. If you remember, we had the former head of the United States Forest Service here a number of months ago, and he said, we asked in regards to a mine in northern Minnesota, okay, where's an appropriate place to mine in America? Well, not where water is. Well, okay, how about resolution out in Arizona? Not much water out in Arizona. Well, I don't know if that's a good place either. Whatever place that is suggested, there's always a problem, and you can't build a mine there. That's where the term appropriate comes, like we just heard from this gentleman. You said in regards to to withdrawing the land up in Alaska, you said the American people, or the people up there that have a subsistence living, that they would be affected. I think most of the American people, including those in northern Alaska, seek more than subsistence. If the tribal members in northern Alaska, if they would say to you that you did not consult them, if we hear testimony to that effect, would you reconsider that decision of the withdrawal in Alaska if consultation did not happen as they expected?
What I will say, the Secretary made a decision to cancel those leases, and her decision is part of looking at a supplemental to that analysis to determine how to move forward.
So you accept that the Bureau of Land Management, the United States government, did not consult properly with these tribal people?
What I accept is, and it's my understanding that consultation took place, and it's my understanding that, again, after the Secretary looked at the factors of the legal deficiency, she made a decision.
Is there a definition of fair return?
I'm quite sure there is.
Would you provide that definition of fair return that the Bureau of Land Management uses?
We will get back to you, Congressman. Thank you.
Yeah, so what we've been hearing consistently, all the costs, but they never mention the benefits of producing gas and oil to the American people that have been enormous over the last 150 to 200 years. But now we've got $4 a gallon gasoline, once again, where I live in northern Wisconsin, haven't had it for a couple years. Once again, we have that. The American people have a record amount of credit card debt. And we're talking about only reducing production by 14%, which will drive those costs even higher. These are misguided actions, Mr. Chairman, by this administration, and it's time to change course, and it's evident that this administration is not going to do it. The American people have a big decision before them in 2024. I yield back.
Thank you. And to the gentleman from Wisconsin, the consultation appeared to be with the Native community that supported this administration's philosophy of anti-development. And the next gentleman will be Representative Lamborn for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for having this hearing. Thank you to the witness for being here. As a Coloradan, I'm really concerned about something that has just happened with BLM. Last month, BLM issued 2 supplemental environmental impact statements for 2 resource management plans that would withdraw 1.6 million acres of federal land in Colorado from energy production. The protection of the sage grouse is the supposed rationale behind this drastic action, but this species has experienced a 24% increase in the Colorado population since 2019, just in the last 4 years. And with other species, listen to this. Colorado's elk herd is the largest in the nation, has increased from 40,000 in the early 1900s to 300,000 today. Mule deer has gone from 40,000, has increased by 40,000 since just 2018, 5 years ago. And our population of antelope has gone from 5,000 in the 40s to 85,000 today. And I bring up these different species in addition to the sage grouse because all of this has been done with oil and gas production nearby. There's no dichotomy. You can have both. Colorado is the 4th largest producer of oil in the country, and yet still finds a way to responsibly ensure a robust and healthy ecosystem. So, Mr. Ned, why does the BLM feel it is appropriate to hurt Americans and my own state of Colorado with this withdrawal when we're seeing positive benefits in wildlife in every sector?
Yeah, Congressman, I don't believe the Bureau of Land Management intent is to hurt members or hurt the community. The intent is to look at the resources and find a way to create, as we transition to the clean energy economy, to develop these resources. And so looking at the Colorado plan is to update the analysis and ensure that we're thoughtful in where and how we develop.
I understand that this administration has an anti-fossil fuel agenda, but this decision seems to me to be based on an excuse. The rationale is sage grouse are being hurt and we have to protect the sage grouse. And that's just a fig leaf. That's just a poor excuse to make this action because the population has been going up for sage grouse and these other species are thriving as well. So looking back to 2015, Mr. Ned, what changes have taken place when the original resources management plans were initiated compared to today? Other than that, we have a new White House with a new agenda against fossil fuels. What has changed on the ground?
Clearly, it's my understanding that we have been able to collect data from many sources that shows the analysis that was done then is not as current as it can be to address the impacts today. And those impacts, I cannot speak specifically to what's going on in that district office, but I'm quite sure our state director there or our field would be able to provide some more specifics.
With oil and gas production, there's a significant amount of money that goes into local communities. Besides the immediate jobs and salaries, there's oil and gas royalties that fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund, local education programs, roads, and much more. So what analysis did BLM do, not on the species that supposedly is going to be negatively impacted, which I think is just an excuse and is not valid, but what analysis was done on the effect on communities of people? Because the people are going to have revenue shortfalls that will hurt the Land and Water Conservation Fund and jobs and other things like that. What analysis was done on how the people will be affected?
As land use plans or EISs, whichever, any analysis, we take into account the full impact, and I cannot speak specifically to those two plans, what the analysis, but I'm quite sure it was part of the analysis, and we'll be glad to provide additional information. And again, those plans are out as draft, so we're taking comments and getting input.
Well, could you please supply that to the committee? I'd make that request because I see a negative here with a dubious positive over here, and it just seems like there's an agenda that's driving this that's not being admitted to, that's not being honestly admitted to. Mr. Ned, you say in your testimony that the BLM plans to, quote, avoid leasing in areas with sensitive cultural, wildlife, and recreation resources, end quote. This is so open-ended you could drive any agenda through it. Does this mean that you will not be leasing in areas that have the presence of any endangered species, even if that species happens to be doing better than it was earlier, like the sage grouse?
Yeah, we have a requirement by law to put certain terms and conditions in place for endangered species. And so what the agency is looking at a swath of land or a parcel is how best to develop, looking for the areas that is most likely, probably can be developed, lower conflict, and ensuring, again, that we're protecting what the law tells us to. And under the Endangered Species Act, we have that requirement.
Well, how does that differ from what was the status quo ante? In other words, before the Biden administration came into office, this wasn't the issue that it is now. What has changed, and what will change with this language that you're saying, avoiding leasing in areas with sensitive cultural, wildlife, and recreation resources, which probably is any place in the country would have all or some of those resources? What's BLM going to do differently now?
I think the Bureau, as it learns, as it gathers data, which in 2015 to now it gathers more data, it's looking to see what is the impact. And clearly, Congressman, from where you sit, you've articulated how the species are doing much better. We're hoping, and through our analysis, we will look to see what are those impacts and then put condition in place to ensure we're following, again, if it's an endangered species, the Endangered Species Act, in protecting those species.
Okay, well, thank you for your answers. I'm still not satisfied with what the BLM is doing. I would love to see them reverse this 1.6 million acre withdrawal of federal land in Colorado from energy production. And that should be what actually takes place. Thank you for being here, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. We will now recognize Representative Hagman from Wyoming, who was waived on to the committee.
Thank you. Deputy Director Ned, we have heard on a number of occasions that the BLM is not issuing applications for permits to drill for leases that are involved in litigation brought on by special interest groups. This neglect to issue APDs is happening even though the courts have not issued injunctions ordering the BLM to stop issuing the APDs. In other words, the BLM is breaking the law. Deputy Director, in May of this year, the governor of the state of Wyoming sent a letter to Tracy Stone Manning, the director of Bureau of Land Management, addressing this specific issue. And I request unanimous consent to submit the governor's letter for the record.
Without objection.
According to the first paragraph of this letter, the governor stated, as we briefly discussed during my visit on February 8th, it appears that in Wyoming, the BLM has completely halted approvals of oil and gas drilling permits and routine authorizations on any acreage involved in environmental lawsuits, even if not judicially ordered to do so. This unnecessary self-imposed moratorium is extremely concerning, highly unusual, and has negative cumulative impacts for state revenue and for the economic health of this state, and I would add for this country. Now, it seems to me that this policy that the BLM has adopted would incentivize every environmental group out there to file a lawsuit challenging every single oil and gas permit approval, regardless of merit, to hold up the project indefinitely. Why in the world would the BLM want to incentivize even more frivolous lawsuits against energy development in this country?
Congresswoman, where I don't believe our actions is to incentivize anyone to file lawsuit. However,
But the fact is, your actions do. And so what I want to know is, why is it BLM policy to incentivize additional frivolous lawsuits against energy development in the United States?
again, that is not our policy, Congresswoman.
So Deputy Director Ned, would you commit to following the law by doing your job and issuing APDs for leases involved in litigation?
I will commit to following the law by issuing
Thank you very much.
APDs.
Are you aware that the average barrel of non-U.S. produced oil is produced in a country that scores significantly lower than the United States, based on an environmental performance index by Yale University's Institute of Energy Research? Were you aware of that?
I am not aware of that Yale study,
Okay, does
Congresswoman.
it surprise you?
I am not aware with the study, so I cannot comment on it.
Okay, why would this administration insist on exporting our economy and our jobs to other nations to do something that we can do better?
Again, the administration approach is how to transition to a
I'd
clean
like you
energy
to answer my
economy.
question. Why are you exporting our economy and our jobs to countries to do things that we can do better?
Congresswoman, you asked a question. I was attempting to give you an answer. Again,
Don't think you're answering my question. You're talking about transition. You're not addressing the question of why would we export jobs to other countries to do things that we can do better?
again, as we transition to a new energy economy, we're looking how to develop the resources, both renewable and non-renewable, Congresswoman. I am
Okay,
not aware of exporting jobs.
Unreliable, I think, is a better word to use. You recently issued the Rock Springs RMP, and this, I think, is an example of things to come. And every state that has federal lands within its borders, specifically BLM lands, should recognize what now the intent of the BLM is. This Rock Springs RMP will exclude, prohibit, and bar all access, management, and use of vast swaths of federal land throughout the United States. You exclude not only oil and gas development, but livestock grazing and recreation. And is it your intent to prohibit American citizens from accessing their lands?
Congresswoman, our intent is to use the land in a way that allows all Americans, both present and future generation, to enjoy and benefit from it.
Why is it that every policy this administration pursues is intended to create energy poverty?
I just can't agree with that premise, so I cannot answer to that.
How well do third world countries do in terms of protecting the environment?
Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with all.
Well, let's use the Congo as an example. Do those mining activities in the Congo comport with our mining laws, NEPA, ESA, and that sort of thing?
I am not familiar with the Congo's laws and rules.
You're not familiar with the fact that the vast majority of our cobalt comes from countries such as the Congo? You're not aware of that?
Congresswoman, you asked me if I'm aware of the law violating it, and I'm not familiar with the law.
Do you have any idea of whether Congo complies with child labor laws?
Again, you're asking me in a question.
Do you know whether the Congo complies with child labor laws? The answer is yes or no.
I have not studied Congo, so I cannot give you an answer.
Have you seen the videos of the little children out mining in the Congo to mine for cobalt so that we can have what you refer to as renewables?
I don't know what video you're speaking about,
You haven't
Congresswoman.
seen the videos.
I don't know what video you're speaking about,
Do you think
Congresswoman.
it is appropriate to buy cobalt from countries that use child labor to produce it?
Again, I can speak for what the Bureau of Land
No,
Management
I
is.
want to know the position. This is the question. Do you believe it is appropriate for us to buy cobalt from countries that use child labor to produce it? It's a yes or no answer.
It's not a yes or no for me,
It is a
Congresswoman.
yes or no
It's not a
answer.
yes or no for me, Congresswoman. I'm an official of the Bureau of Land Management, and I can speak to the Bureau of Land Management. I am not an expert on Congo, nor am I an expert on child labor or labor laws.
Is it the BLM's policy to buy cobalt from countries that use child labor to produce it?
The BLM does not procure cobalt.
But the companies that you're advocating for do. I yield back.
Thank you. We will now recognize Representative Huffman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always a bit of an ideological journey when we talk about oil and gas and mineral extraction here in this committee. So let me just offer you, Mr. Ned, do you need any more time to clarify anything in response to the pretty aggressive questioning you were just subjected to?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, as an official of the Bureau of Land Management, my job is to ensure that we follow the rules, to follow the law, to be safe, to be legal, to be ethical. And I am in no way, the Bureau of Land Management has policies about buying material from anyone that violates child labor law.
Thank you. I want to ask you about the Arctic Refuge. And of course, to me, it was very good news last week when the Biden administration announced it would cancel the 7 remaining leases in the refuge's coastal plain. I want to commend you for that. The Trump administration was trying to jam that through on a deeply flawed environmental review process, and now we have a chance to be more thoughtful and to comply with the law as we move forward. This prospect of drilling in the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge is not very attractive to most folks in the oil and gas industry. Wouldn't you agree?
It's complex. It is complex, and it's harder than the lower 48.
I'm referring to the fact that Chevron and Hilcorp paid millions of dollars to get out of leases on the corporation lands within the coastal plain. Two lessees voluntarily relinquished their leases. Shows that even big oil knows that it's not very profitable to drill there. Wouldn't you agree?
I say they realize it's very complex and it's challenging.
Okay. We can certainly agree it's complex and challenging, but it's also not very profitable for big oil. Can you speak to some of the complications, barriers, and risks to drilling in the refuge?
Well, again, the Arctic Refuge, given the sensitivity of the land, it's really building roads when the ice, in the period where you can travel over there, it's moving massive equipment in that cannot be lower than the 48. And then it's an area that is used for subsistence support for the communities. And so again, protecting those areas, protecting and ensuring that resources are not damaged in a way that is non-recoverable.
And when the Trump administration did have a lease sale, there wasn't much interest in this. Would you agree? I mean, there were just a few bidders. Most of the leases went to a state of Alaska-owned corporation that I would say has questionable capacity to even move forward on developing those leases.
Yeah, I cannot speak to the questionable capacity, but I can speak to, yes, it was 3, and the state, an entity on behalf of, in Alaska, acquired 7 of the leases.
We've got a lot of deadbeat leases out there on BLM lands, right?
We do.
So is it normal to grant a lease to a bidder that would seem to lack capacity to even develop that lease? It would seem to be a speculative venture, maybe to just tie up land to benefit some future developer. Is it normal for BLM to just rubber stamp leases under those circumstances?
We work to issue lease to people who are financially and technically capable of developing it, so both financially and technically.
That should be a factor in determining whether someone gets the lease, is what I'm hearing you say, correct?
That is the standards we use.
Can you tell me a little more about the NPRA announcement last week and some of the specifics about how the proposed rule in the NPRA will better protect these important special areas that are uniquely vulnerable to climate change and uniquely important for biodiversity and other values?
Yes, when Congress enacted the Petroleum Reserve, they defined, I think it was 4 or 5 areas that were special areas, areas that are used for subsistence primarily or to protect waters or other resources. This rule will help put a framework in place to make certain that as we look at those areas, we can take the necessary step to protect it. Currently, without those rules, it is vulnerable, and so the intent is to put some rules in place to make certain we follow not only the intent of Congress, but to manage those special areas in a way that benefits the generations.
I thank you, Mr. Ned, and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. I do want to clarify something. Mr. Ned, my good friend, Mr. Huffman, asked or mentioned rubber stamping. In your 18 years at the BLM, have you, quote, ever rubber stamped, end quote, any leases?
We have not in my knowledge.
Thank
I
you
have
very
no
much.
direct knowledge of rubber stamping.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hunt, you are up for 5 minutes. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here, sir. Thank you for your prior service as well. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your time here. Energy is kind of oil and gas, energy, BLM, big deal to me. From Houston, Texas, known as the energy capital of the world. The entire energy corridor is in my district. That makes me the energy congressman of the entire world. So this is why this is something that for me is very, very important that we get right, that we have timely leases, that we have these companies that can predict their future, that they can continue to build and grow, provide energy not just for us, not just for the U.S., but also for our allies. And so with that being said, I have two questions for you. On November the 30th, 2022, the Bureau of Land Management proposed an updated venting and flaring rule. Are you familiar with that, sir?
I am.
Okay. What's the purpose of establishing this greenhouse emission reporting framework for BLM and venting and flaring? And my question for you is, shouldn't any action for the BLM be harmonized with the EPA that already had an existing rule?
So we did coordinate and had discussion with the EPA, but the rule is really to minimize the waste of resources. And so the rule, again, is put in place to ensure as we develop land or developer develop lands, they have a minimization plan, and they're taking action to mitigate the impacts on the environment and the resources.
So I understand that, but I think a lot of companies that are in my district that do operate on federal lands, their concern is that what you just described is actually not what's happening in real life on the ground. So what's happening on the ground is this: they have to adhere to two completely separate standards. Are you familiar with these companies having to adhere to two separate standards?
I know we have worked to coordinate with the EPA to ensure that we're not in conflict, and it's my understanding we're not. The rule we're putting in place is for the resources that Congress told us to manage.
So you believe that right now the rules that you have set are in conjunction with the EPA entirely, meaning that you think that there is actually only one standard, even though there's two separate rules that are two separate entities that are dictating rules.
I believe our rule is not in conflict with what the EPA is doing, and I believe our rule will allow, again, the BLM, as it permits resources for those to be managed to mitigate those impacts from greenhouse gases or others.
Yes, sir. So moving forward, just something to look at, please, if there is a way that these companies can look at just one rule. And I hear what you're saying, I understand what you're trying to do, but if there is a way, and I know that I'm a military guy, so I get this, but if there is a way where these companies could say, hey, the EPA has the exact same rules would be in BLM, and not necessarily even being harmonized with, just a simple rule or a simple standard when it comes to these greenhouse gases and emissions, I think that would be greatly appreciated. My next question is, are you familiar with communitization agreements?
What, I'm sorry?
Communitization agreements?
I am.
You are? Could you briefly describe what these agreements do and the timeline that you would like to see these agreements move through this process?
Well, first, I should say each agreement has its own complexity.
Okay.
So timeline would be as expeditiously as we can. But when you have multiple owners where resources may intermingle, we then will get a communitization agreement to be formed. And the intent is so the parties can agree on the development, how best to develop that without conflict with each other.
Right.
And again, each one stands on its own because the complexity could be from simple complexity to major complexity.
Okay. I understand that. I think there's been a lot of bureaucracy that we've seen implemented. And I think a lot of these companies literally just want to know what the standards are going to be moving forward for the future. Some of these agreements, in my understanding, there's a company that's reported that some of these agreements took 720 days. Based on your answer, that's probably a very complex agreement that took longer than what anybody could have ever anticipated. However, I do think that 720 days is still a bit egregious. Streamline standards and expectation management and keeping that for the next 5 to 10 years, I think what a lot of companies want to see. We could have extraordinarily stringent regulations. In fact, our country has the most strict and the most stringent regulations in the entire world. I deployed to Saudi Arabia, I've been to Iraq, I understand this. It doesn't matter. As long as we have a standard that is going to be the same standard moving forward so that these companies can predict their workload and leases and agreements, what needs to be done, is all we're asking. Thank you so much for your time. I'll yield back the rest of my time, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Ned, that is all for panel one. At the chair's prerogative, we're going to take a 3-minute recess to allow the second panel to be seated, and we'll get back in action in 3 minutes. Thank you. Okay, the Energy and Mineral Subcommittee will come out of recess. We will now move into our second panel of witnesses to provide testimony. I will now introduce our second panel. Ms. Kathleen Skagama is the president of the Western Energy Alliance based out of Denver, Colorado. Ms. Skagama, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. I don't think your microphone's on.
There we go.
Yeah.
You changed the microphones on me. I can't handle it. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify today. I just want to start off by correcting something that the ranking member said in her opening statement. She claimed that oil and gas production on federal lands is responsible for about 250,000 of greenhouse gas emissions. That's a complete falsehood. That's based on a misreading of a USGS study of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you actually look at the numbers, production on federal lands and waters accounts for 0.6% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, not nearly a quarter. So even the Interior Department stopped using that number after I simply pointed out the numbers from the USGS report. Anyway, I'm struck by the administration moving forward with this whole of government approach against the oil and natural gas industry. I mean, the regulation coming at our industry is astounding. Just one of those rules we're really going to focus on today. And it's not just on my industry, but the financial industry as well, meant to defund the oil and gas industry. And it's done in the name of climate change, attempting to stop the energy sources of oil, gas, and coal that provide 80% of Americans' energy. And to what end? We have an administration doing that in the name of climate change, but then running to Saudi Arabia and before the invasion to Russia, asking for them to increase their production. And was pointed out earlier how our intensity level is so much lower in the United States than in these other countries. So once again, we're in a cycle of high gasoline prices, and yet the president continues to announce plans to curtail yet more American production. And of course, when we have less American production, we have higher prices, and we have to import more. The most recent being, of course, the cancellation of leases in Alaska. The president has let OPEC set energy prices instead of what my industry did just a few short years ago when we made OPEC irrelevant by taking up any slack in U.S. demand, or global demand, not just U.S. demand. We could be producing between 2 and 3 million more barrels a day, but for this whole of government approach to stopping American oil and gas. And there are those who say that we must make these sacrifices in the name of climate change. Yet John Kerry, the climate czar, has himself said we could stop all U.S. greenhouse gas emissions and it would make no difference on global climate change. So to what end are we pursuing these policies that require us to go beg Saudi Arabia for more production? And we also know the ill effects of all these policies. In my written testimony, I have a laundry list of, and all referenced, of ill effects in California and Germany from misguided so-called green energy policies, and so I refer you to those. I really urge the administration not to curtail U.S. oil and gas production, but instead work with us. Not only is it distasteful to run to Saudi Arabia, who doesn't have our best interests at heart, but, you know, you can't transform the energy sector without working with the energy sector itself. We are part of the solution, and we can help as we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions intensity, as we're looking at alternatives. But in the meantime, I urge Congress and this committee to really delve into this whole of government approach and start to demand information from the administration. I think there's a lot of collusion with environmental groups in writing these policies, and I think some of that needs to be aired publicly. When it comes to the BLM leasing rule, we know that BLM is focusing on increasing bonding limits 20-fold 20-fold. It would upend the bonding market. And to what end? There are 37 orphan wells on BLM lands, down from 296 in 2019. So BLM, using the authority it already has to go after bad actors and to adjust bonding amounts as necessary, has reduced orphan wells to basically a non-problem. So those last few remaining orphan wells, the industry provides $55 for every dollar BLM spends on the oil and gas program. We're providing plenty of funds for that, and most of those orphan wells, BLM is pursuing responsible companies for those because the chain of command, or the chain of custody on a well extends beyond the original driller of that well. My time's expired. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you very much. We will now recognize Mr. Novotny for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cortez. Thank you for holding a hearing to discuss emerging management issues impacting oil and gas programs. My name is Bill Novotny. I represent the fourth generation of my family to call Wyoming home. I currently serve as president of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association and am chairman of my local board of county commissioners. I also serve on the board of directors of the National Associations of Counties. At home, I'm the owner of a public affairs firm where I represent one of Wyoming's major travel and tourism industries, which is a major component of our economy. My family also raises sheep and cattle, and we've been involved in the timber and oil and gas industry. I am here today on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. In 1884, 6 years before Wyoming became a state, the first oil well was drilled in modern-day Fremont County. 125 years later, oil and natural gas continue to be vital industries for Wyoming, providing essential revenue for counties and state government, providing citizens with well-paying jobs, and delivering to our nation affordable and reliable energy. Taxes derived from oil and gas developed in Wyoming constitute a significant portion of state and county revenue used to pay for public education and essential services including roads, fire protection, courthouses, libraries, landfills, hospitals, law enforcement, airports, recreation, and senior citizen services. Property taxes on oil and gas account for over 40% of the total property taxes levied in Wyoming, and over 55% of property taxes levied in my Johnson County. In 2020, the property taxes collected by counties exceeded $600 million. Severance taxes collected by the state in 2020 topped $275 million. When adding in federal leases, revenues, federal and state royalties, sales and use taxes, and conservation taxes, this industry contributed $1.23 billion in taxes to state and local governments. The industry also supports between 35,000 and 58,000 jobs and provides up to $5.6 billion in wages in 2021 figures. For every direct job, the industry generates an additional 1.9 indirect jobs in services, whether it's wholesale, construction, transportation, and manufacturing. This equates to the oil and gas industry supporting between 12 and 19% of my state's total workforce. Wyoming is the 10th largest state, covering approximately 97,000 square miles or 62.6 million acres, and the BLM manages approximately 18 million surface acres and an additional 41 million acres of minerals in the state. Such substantial federal lands and mineral management creates a hodgepodge of interwoven fabric with state and private lands and minerals across Wyoming. This interwoven ownership pattern of federally managed minerals with state and private minerals means that oil and gas has to be co-produced. Wyoming's oil and gas production from federally managed lands accounts for between 72 and 74% of my state's entire mineral production. The Department of Interior Natural Resource Revenue data reports that Wyoming's federal lands supported $1.65 billion in revenue for the year of 2022, and the DOI dispensed $785 million to the state of Wyoming, primarily revenue from oil and gas production. It is important to understand that changes in federal management do not solely impact federal managed lands and minerals. Nearly all developed in Wyoming, including on private and state lands, is impacted by the administration's management decisions. Attempting to thread the needle around federally managed lands to avoid a federal nexus is imprudent, impractical, and quite frankly, impossible. While the stated objective of oil and gas onshore operations is to promote the orderly and efficient exploration and development and production of oil and gas, the Biden administration's approach to bonding, leasing, and permit issuance is neither orderly or efficient. Speaking specifically to bonding, the BLM manages approximately 94,000 federal wells, including 27,383 in Wyoming. Each year, between 15 and 24 wells are reclaimed by the BLM, accounting for 0.00159 to 0.000255% of all wells managed by the BLM. Yet their annual liability for reclamation is $2.7 million. Over the past 2 years, the BLM average gross revenue from oil and gas production was over $8.6 billion, making the 2.7 spent on reclamation a liability of less than 0.5%. That's a rounding error, not a cause to upend the bonding structure for the entire industry. Nevertheless, to remedy its $2.7 million liability, the BLM has proposed to substantially increase federal bonding for all operators in its fluid mineral lease and leasing process rule. Due in accurately assuming every Wyoming operator can qualify for a low-cost surety, the BLM alleges the increased cost to industry would only be between $4.7 and $9.1 million. This is simply inaccurate. The BLM currently holds $85 million in bonding. At current bonding levels, 84% of operators in Wyoming are able to utilize surety bonds, while the remaining 16% of operators having to post dollar-for-dollar coverage. This equates to $71 million covered by sureties at a cost of $3.5 or $2.499 million in annual interest payments, while the remaining $13.6 million is paid dollar for dollar.
Mr. Novotny, can you wrap it up?
Yes, sir. I do apologize. I will remain for questions, and you have my full statement for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That's right, we have your statement. Thank you very much. I will now introduce our next witness, Dr. Barbara Vasquez, who is a citizen scientist and advocate from the Western Organization of Resource Councils based in Billings, Montana. Dr. Vasquez, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stauber, and I appreciate the invitation from you and Ranking Member Ocasio-Cortez for this opportunity to testify. After earning a PhD in biochemistry, I pursued 2 distinct careers: biomedical research with the NIH, followed by various positions with increasing responsibility in the semiconductor industry, working in 4 different countries. I retired with the goal of working to help conserve...
Dr. Vasquez, excuse me, could you bring the microphone a little closer, if you can? Thank you very much.
There was quite a bit of resistance on the wire. I apologize. I retired with the goal of working to help conserve and protect healthy communities, watersheds, and wildlife in the West. And I chose Jackson County, Colorado, my forever home, a rural county covering 1,600 square miles. And I live 2 miles from the border of the beautiful state of Wyoming, 65% of which is public and with fewer than 1 person per square mile. County is bounded by a ring of mountains and wilderness areas and forms the headwaters of the North Platte. Most of the floor of the basin is priority habitat for greater sage-grouse. I served 7 years on the BLM's Northwest Colorado Resource Advisory Council, where I had a ringside seat in how BLM manages our public lands. I've worked as a volunteer citizen scientist on oil and gas issues since '06, work that's expanded in the past 7 years in my work with the Western Organization of Resource Councils and the Colorado affiliate, Western Colorado Alliance, and it's that work that brings me before you today. Work as a regional network of grassroots community organizations in 7 western states based in Billings, Montana. Like many of WORK's members and many Westerners, I live near oil and gas operations and directly experience their impacts. Drawing from the title of this hearing, the primary element of mismanagement of oil and gas program by the BLM, in my opinion, has been the decades of delay in updating the financial elements of the program. One long overdue change mentioned by the previous speakers is the reclamation bonds operators are required to post. The Mineral Leasing Act requires the Secretary to establish adequate bonds that ensure the complete and timely reclamation of lease tracts and the restoration of any lands and surface waters adversely affected by lease operations. Reclamation is a universally accepted requirement, and the bonds are a well-established way of ensuring that reclamation occurs, a basic cost of doing business. Yet the BLM has not increased minimum bond amounts for 60 years, lagging decades behind many states. Although BLM has the authority to increase bonds over the minimum amounts set in the rules, they seldom do so. The GAOs showed in 2019, 82% of the bonds are set at minimum amounts. And as a result, over 99% of federal wells carry bonds that are insufficient to cover the full cost of reclamation. That means that oil and gas operators are often financially incentivized to skip out of their responsibilities at the end of the economically useful life of wells, pushing the cost to taxpayers. Unfortunately, we've seen this play out in Colorado recently. And BLM's track record of ensuring timely reclamation is abysmal. Federal wells often remain idle for years or decades before they're declared orphaned and then plugged and reclaimed. The GAO has identified 5,100 wells that have been idle for 7 or more years, including over 2,300 that have been idle for more than 25 years. At the recent rate of plugging and reclamation, 15 to 24 wells per year, it would take approximately 250 years to clear the inventory, which continues to grow as we wait. This number, of course, does not account for the wells that are plugged by the operator. As long as idle and orphaned wells remain unplugged, they'll potentially leak methane and volatile organic chemicals into the air and hydrocarbons into oil and water. These potential leaks threaten the health and safety of local residents and wildlife and contribute to climate change. It's critical that BLM get this growing idle and orphan well crisis under control now, particularly in the face of increased costs to reclaim the deeper modern wells. Last week, the IEA projected fossil fuel production to peak much earlier than forecast, no later than 2030, due to the accelerating transition to renewables. As the demand declines for fossil fuels, not just here in this country, but globally, oil and gas companies will experience declining revenues, increasing the risk of a tsunami of abandoned wells unless adequate bonds are in place. And in Jackson County, we live on both sides of this crisis with a legacy field of shallow, old oil wells to the northeast and newer, deep shale oil wells to the southwest. These new wells present much greater liabilities for the cost of plugging and abandonment. And I thank you for your time and interest.
Thank you for your testimony. I will now introduce Mr. Nagaruk Harcharek, who is the president for the Voice of the Arctic Inupiat, based in Anchorage, Alaska. Mr. Harcharek, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good morning, Chairman Westerman, Chairman Stauber, Ranking Member Ocasio-Cortez, and members of the committee. Thank you for having me here today. Recent decisions made by the administration have serious consequences for the future of the North Slope Inupiat. We are the only indigenous group that has continually inhabited the land where the federal government carved out the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. My name is Nagaruk Harcharek, and I am honored to serve my people as the president of the Voice of the Arctic Inupiat, known as Voice. Voice is a nonprofit dedicated to preserving and advancing North Slope Inupiat cultural and economic self-determination. Our 24-member board includes the leadership of local governments, federally recognized tribes, Alaska Native corporations, and tribal nonprofits from across the North Slope. Since Alaska became part of the U.S. in 1867, the North Slope Inupiat have continually been an afterthought for the federal government. For thousands of years, we have been the stewards of the Arctic lands, waters, and the animals. We are integral to the Arctic ecosystem, as ubiquitous as the caribou, polar bears, birds, berries, and fish. Yet when Washington takes action in the Arctic, our people are an afterthought. During the Aboriginal land claims fight that resulted in enactment of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, or ANCSA, our people were the only Alaska Native group to oppose the law. Prior to the passage of ANCSA, over 75% of the land in our region was taken off the table without fair compensation. 44 million acres of the over 55 million our people originally claimed during the land claims fight, including 23 million acres for NPRA, 9 million acres for ANWR, and 12 million acres conveyed to the state of Alaska after statehood. Prior to ANCSA in 1966, Interior Secretary Stuart Udall imposed a land freeze. No further land conveyances could take place until Congress addressed Aboriginal land claims. The discovery of commercial quantities of oil in 1968 in our region led to ANCSA's enactment in 3 short years. Take a moment to think about what drove that rapid passage of ANCSA. 52 years after ANCSA, the federal government continues to make decisions about our ancestral homelands, now in the name of environmental justice, with little to no regard for the voices of our people, and there is no justice in that approach. The recent proposal by the administration to take nearly 13 million acres within NPRA and adjacent waters into special protected status, and the foreclosure of leases within the 1002 area of the coastal plain of ANWR was done without consulting our people. NPRA and the 1002 area of ANWR were set aside by the federal government specifically for their potential to secure the energy future of the United States and the economic self-determination of the North Slope Inupiat. The North Slope, an area roughly the size of Minnesota, provides for our people, our communities, our culture, and our economy. Our leaders formed the North Slope Borough, akin to a county or large municipal government, to ensure our people and communities would rightly benefit from the development that takes place on our ancestral homelands. The borough, as a home rule government, has, among other things, zoning, permitting, and taxation authorities, which allows it to levy taxes on infrastructure. That tax base provides employment opportunities and services like modern water and sewer system, waste collection, search and rescue, wildlife research, planning and community development, education, and road construction, and maintenance in all 8 communities on the North Slope. Of the 8 communities, 4 lie within NPRA, and 1, Kaktovik, is the only community located within the 1002 area of ANWR. Responsible resource development with the inclusion and engagement of our communities has taken place for over 50 years. It's a positive model of cultural, economic, and ecological interdependence. Responsible resource development and the economic foundation it provides has enhanced our culture in many ways. A healthy jobs base provides us the economic means to afford modern technology, making our hunting activities safer and more efficient. Funding supports our schools and curriculum, which is rooted in our Inupiaq culture. And we provide these services to our people and communities with little or no help from the state or federal government. Who will provide these essential services if we have no economy? We are a strong people. We have lived and survived in the world's harshest environment for millennia. We refuse to fall victim to policies made thousands of miles away and will always fight for our self-determination. But it does not have to be a fight. We believe that strength comes from unity and cooperation, and we understand the importance of that value locally, regionally, and nationally. This is why the Voice was created. I invite you to develop a stronger partnership between the North Slope and Washington, D.C. Together, we can right historic wrongs, create responsible resource development projects in our region, and fully realize Inupiat self-determination. This can only happen with consistent and respectful policymaking responsive to the needs and rights of Indigenous communities. That must start with meeting us where we are. I invite you to visit our communities and engage with our people. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for your testimony and all the witnesses for your expert testimony. It's greatly appreciated. We're now going to recognize members for 5 minutes of questions, and again, I recognize myself first for 5 minutes. Mr. Harcharek, as I raised with Deputy Director Ned in my line of questioning with him, the White House National Strategy for the Arctic Region released last year says under Pillar 3, quote, "We will also work with allies and partners to expand high standard investment and sustainable development across the Arctic region," end quote. Do you believe the administration's recent announcements will lead to high standard investment and sustainable development across the region?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that the recent announcements, clearly in my written testimony and what I just said, limit our ability to responsibly develop our resources, especially on the North Slope where these 2 policies targeted.
And that will limit the building of roads and bridges and healthcare centers and law enforcement, schools. Would that be correct?
That is accurate. It limits our ability and shrinks our economic our economic potential, so to speak. And it also, in addition to all of the services that it provides, with Anwar specifically in the village of Kaktovik, it limits access to other things like broadband. Recently, they were trying to get broadband internet. They required a tower that was in the 1002 area. That proposal was denied. They can't even take ATVs or four-wheelers within the refuge to subsist. So it's extremely limiting access in many ways.
And under principle number 1 of the strategy, it states the administration will, quote, consult, coordinate, and co-manage with the Alaska Native tribes and communities, end quote. Do you believe the administration properly coordinated with tribal communities before making these disastrous policy decisions?
In this case, it's clear to me with the members that make up the voice, some of them being cooperating agencies, they have not consulted with the people on the North Slope.
And you were present in the room when I specifically asked the deputy director, and the deputy director said he believed in his mind they did. You're refuting that statement, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. As a chair, I'm going to give you and the voice an opportunity to submit a letter to that fact, and I will accept it without objection. The fact that they did not consult before the disastrous decision, if that's what if you want, and I will accept that. I'm really disappointed to hear that, but unfortunately not surprised. This administration did not seek the input of my constituents, rather, in northeastern Minnesota as well, when they withdrew 225,504 acres from critical mineral development in the Superior National Forest earlier this year. And as the committee heard testimony on a few weeks ago, the administration did not consult with the Navajo Nation before instituting a 10-mile-wide buffer zone around Chaco Canyon, blocking oil and gas development, a decision those communities also did not support. Ms. Sagama, in your opinion, is the BLM in compliance with the leasing requirements in the Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, in some respects they are, because Congress raised royalty rates and various other fees. BLM has gone beyond that and did what Congress did not want to do in IRA by increasing bonding amounts 20-fold. We look at some of those bonding amounts, and if you take the rule at face value, a statewide bond would only apply to 7 wells. So we have a small member company that reported that their 3,500 wells would cost them $250 million.
So they're not following the Inflation
That's right.
Reduction Act?
And they're adding additional fees as well.
So they're not following the Inflation Reduction Act as
Right.
intended. And since they are not, should the Bureau of Land Management be able to issue rights of way for renewable energy projects?
I think that's kind of a little bit of a separate issue in that they're clearly not moving forward with enough leased acreage to support doing much when it comes to wind and solar permits. So if they really want to pursue an all-of-the-above strategy, they should get on with some leasing of oil and gas.
In the earlier testimony, my good friend and colleague from Nevada said referenced some lease sales. Would you say the total lease sales was about 181 acres in the state of Nevada?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know that the latest sale had 0 bids on it. You know, we've had a hard time cracking the code in Nevada. There have been many companies that have tried it over the years. I would like to address her point, because it's completely wrong, that once you lease or nominate lands, they don't hold up the lands at all. It's not as if those lands are not available for recreation or whatever other multiple uses. That's a fallacy that you hear from the environmental lobby that she just repeated, which is not, it's factually inaccurate.
Thank you. Mr. Novetny, this administration has held 3 onshore lease sales in your great state of Wyoming. In each one, the acreage actually offered in the sale had decreased radically from what was initially proposed. Can you explain what impacts these lackluster sales will have on Wyoming communities? And before you answer that, I love your background as a part of the county commission. I was too, so please answer the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, county commissioners are where the rubber meets the road. We are charged with providing the most essential services, whether it's the community hospital that we have that writes off millions of dollars in uncompensated care or underpayment from Medicare and Medicaid. They make up that difference in the severance tax and the ad valorem tax that they receive. If I am unable to meet my county budget requirements, I cannot provide essential services like fire, EMS, and others. We have a solid working relationship with the other counties across the state, but the bottom line is if we do not have the ability to raise revenue and create good and lasting jobs in our community, the West is going to just wither away. We have to have reasonable and responsible development, and we do it right in Wyoming. And we've been doing it right since before statehood. And that revenue then is multiplied in my community so that we can send kids to school, have incredible opportunities like Wyoming's Hathaway Scholarship, where every kid in the state of Wyoming is going to qualify for some level of higher education at the University of Wyoming or one of our community colleges.
You know, we talk about the Great American Outdoor Act, which is a vast majority is paid for by oil and gas royalties. Mr. Acharek, I commit to you that as long as I am privileged to be chair of this community, or this committee, that your community will be represented. It pains me to hear you say that this administration never consulted with your 8 communities on the North Slope over this disastrous decision. I want to commit to you and your people that we will build a relationship so you can be an economic driver in Alaska. Yes, you are a ways away from Washington, D.C., but I want you to know that that commitment comes as long as I'm privileged to serve as chair of this community.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I will, we're going to now recognize Mr. Rosendale for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Sorry. I'm going to dive right into some questions, Mr. Chair. I appreciate you holding this hearing. Appreciate the lack of attendance from our friends on the other side of the aisle. Apparently, they're not too concerned about developing critical minerals and domestic energy, so as witnessed by the lack of their attendance. Ms. Gamma, it's always great to see you in here again. In your opinion, why is the administration relying on countries that produce dirtier natural gas and oil with less strict environmental standards for these critical resources rather than relying on the bounty of natural gas and oil that we have right here in our own country?
Please don't ask me to try to explain that. No, I mean, I don't know. We do it cleaner here, and we should be creating the jobs here instead of sending them overseas.
I appreciate that, and we all probably would agree with that idea. You mentioned in your testimony that you'd like us to submit formal requests relating to the coordination between the Department of Interior and environmental and activist groups. Do you have any personal experiences that have led you to believe that outside activist groups are inappropriately influencing the Department of Interior?
I wish I had time to file all those FOIA requests. Because the administration doesn't honor them, you have to sue to get any information. And so I just don't have the resources to sue on every single FOIA request that would come up.
So you have been forced to, you've made FOIA requests, you're trying to get the information so that you can see this communication is taking place, and when they have been unanswered, you're saying that you actually have filed lawsuits so that, or the organization has filed lawsuits so that you can get that information?
We have in the past, we have not during this administration, kind of gave up on that strategy just because it's so costly. Protect the Public's Trust has done a pretty good job on filing FOIA lawsuits, and they did one, or they got information on the collusion between the Interior Department and activist groups surrounding the Chaco Canyon withdrawal. So I think that was a successful effort that I'm aware of.
I appreciate that. I think the Protect the Public's Trust, I think that's also the same group that filed the information requests that we've been trying to get in regards to the Secretary Holland's daughter and her lobbying activities with Interior and other members, and her actual participation in some protests which turned violent, as I understand.
That's right. They've done a good job digging up some information.
Okay, as your testimony suggests, the bonding provisions in a recently proposed rule by BLM would price small companies out of the bonding process. And you said, based on that, you had affirmed that on the 6 or 7 wells, in the area, if you average that across the state, they would end up having to post like $250 million. Since Biden has taken office, do you believe that the actions have disproportionately harmed small businesses rather than the multinational oil and gas corporations? And what other types of rules have they put in place to basically choke out these smaller firms?
Well, the backbone of the oil and gas industry is the small company. The majors can certainly absorb most of these costs, although even they can't absorb all these costs all the time. But yes, when you increase royalty rates and increase fees and increase bonding amounts, it's the small company that bears the brunt.
So not only the increase of fees and imposing these regulations, but what we're also hearing about, and I've heard from some of my independent drillers in Yellowstone County, there in Montana, is the inability for them to access capital. Are you hearing the same kinds of things down in Colorado where, because of these ESG standards that the federal government has imposed, and unfortunately many financial institutions have embraced, the environmental social governance standards has choked out the ability for these independents, in your experience, to have access to capital to perform their work as well?
Absolutely. They have increased the cost of capital, and we have several member companies that have reported to me that they can't get a loan or they can't get, they can't raise capital.
Very good. I'm going to get one more question in, Mr. Chair. Mr. Novotny, we heard you talking about the bonding and the reclamation efforts and things like that. What's the use and condition of some of these reclaimed lands? I'm sure you've traveled out to that. I'm sure you've seen them. Have you? What's the use and the condition of those reclaimed lands after that work is done?
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Rosendale, it's incredible. You look at the Powder River Basin where the coal is mined. The land is in better pristine environmental condition than prior to, and they're required to do the environmental monitoring before and after, so they have the scientific data to prove it. Where oil and gas production is occurring, sage grouse use it as leks, deer, antelope, elk migrate through these areas. It is pristine. We care about the environment. It's a major component of our travel and tourism economy, so we're not going to upset our three-legged stool by cutting off one of those legs.
Very good. Thank you so much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentle lady from California, Representative Kamlager Dove, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here today. I have a couple of questions. I'd like to start with Dr. Vasquez. So I understand that as a scientist and an advocate, you have been sounding the alarm about the harm caused by orphaned oil and gas wells for years. You sound like many of my constituents in Culver City and in the Baldwin Hills area. Given your expertise, I would like to set the record straight on some of the misleading claims made today about bonding and the abandoned and orphan well crisis. Ms. Sagama claimed that the Department of the Interior said there were only 37 orphaned wells on federal lands, and therefore there really is no problem. I think this is an extreme cherry picking of the data and covers up the way the oil and gas industry routinely leaves wells unplugged and polluting for years by hiding behind the definition of orphan. So Dr. Vasquez, can you explain what it takes for a well to be officially declared orphaned on federal lands?
It's a complex process, and I appreciate the question. First of all, previously it took 7 years before the BLM would declare a well that was not producing as idle. Now, by legislation, it takes 4 years. That's an improvement, but that's still a long time for a well to be out of production and not plugged and reclaimed. Following that, in order to be declared orphan, the BLM pursues a chain of custody and ownership of leases to try and find a financially responsible party. Sometimes they're successful and that party reclaims, plugs the well and reclaims. Sometimes they're not. And in the absence of a sufficient bond, there's an incentive to walk away from wells rather than to exercise their responsibility to plug and reclaim the well.
Thank you for that. And does the number of officially orphaned wells accurately reflect how many non-producing oil and gas wells are currently sitting unplugged and potentially polluting on public lands?
It does not, and actually the GAO study indicated that there were 5,100 orphaned wells, and recent testimony by Nada Culver of the BLM indicated in 2021 that there were 2,100. So the number appears to be in great contention, and that's probably because of problems with record keeping and the use of different terms to indicate wells that are not producing. So each of these wells, once they're out of production, offers the opportunity to leak methane and volatile organic chemicals into the atmosphere, risking public health, wildlife health, and climate change impacts.
Thank you for that. You, once again, sound like so many of my constituents at the town halls that I host. I have the largest urban oil field in my district that is in the United States, and we have had dozens and dozens of hearings in town halls, and I'm listening to grandparents talk about putting metal stints in their 7-year-old grandchildren's bodies because of the after effects of living close to oil fields where toxins are being emitted all the time, and folks are shirking their responsibility and evading the costs that it takes to do this kind of work and keeping people safe. So my next question for you is, how will BLM's proposed rule, including the updating bonding requirements, help stop these wells from polluting?
The only way we can stop these wells from polluting is getting them plugged and reclaimed rapidly, and that is not happening. The imposition of a higher bond level, which is not as high as they're looking at in Colorado for federal wells, will certainly incentivize the operators to take care of that responsibility quickly. It doesn't make sense to hold a well in operation when it's not economically viable, and yet we see a lot of these wells just sitting idle without being reclaimed.
And tell us again why you think that's happening.
The reason it's happening, in my opinion, is because the financial incentive to do the work required is not there, that companies can just walk away and abandon wells without doing the plugging and remediation. If they have a bond, then both the state and the federal governments for the wells involved have an opportunity to gather those funds and use them for plugging and reclamation.
Thank you so much for that, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before we go to Representative Tiffany from Wisconsin, Ms. Sagama, I believe it's important when we bring witnesses in. When Dr. Vasquez was answering the question on orphan wells, I saw you shake your head. Do you want to respond to that, to the number of wells, orphan wells, please?
Sure. The GAO report from 2019 identified 296 orphan wells on BLM lands. That's a fact. The issue of idle wells is not, an idle well does not mean an orphan well. So there are various reasons that companies idle wells for a time. That could include that they want to go back into that well bore in the future and hit another formation, for example. So rather than develop a whole new well, you can use that existing well bore, go deeper, and get another, hit another formation, rock formation, such as some of these shales that have been extremely productive. So an idle well is not an orphan well. The GAO also identified that probably many of the idle wells that had been idle for quite some time were a matter of poor record keeping by BLM, and that many of those were probably plugged and abandoned properly. So that is another issue. And I would just point out that the chain of custody on wells is not a negative. It's very positive. So if one company goes bankrupt, BLM then goes to other companies that previously had that well. Even if they sold those assets, they will go back to that original company that developed the well. So they have a whole bunch of different responsible partners, or partners in that original well, or chains of custody along that well, so that very few wells actually become orphaned, because you go and you grab another company and they're responsible. And the reason that BLM just reported only 37 orphan wells, and again, that's a fact. That was a report back from the Assistant Secretary in response to questions from the record, that there are only 37 wells, down from 296, and that's because companies have been reclaiming those wells. Most of those wells were not reclaimed by BLM, but by companies at company expense.
Thank you very much. We're now going to recognize Representative Tiffany from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hocharik, I'm sorry I wasn't here for your testimony. Is it accurate that you were, the tribes you represent were not consulted with the Arctic withdrawal that just happened?
That is accurate, yes.
You were not consulted?
The cooperating agencies that are members of the organization that I represent were not consulted, no.
What do you think should be done about that?
You know, I wish that the administration would follow some of their strategies and memos outlining the willingness and the want to consult with indigenous communities, and the willingness and the want to stand them up economically through whatever lens they want to look at it. I would hope that they would continue to move forward and put action to those words.
In other words, they should follow the law. What benefits have Alaskans gotten from oil in Alaska since it was found?
Huge.
Started producing back in the 60s or 70s. Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. Huge benefits, at least for the North Slope. 95% of the revenue that's generated with the North Slope borough is funded through the taxation of oil and gas infrastructure, and those dollars are reinvested into the 8 communities that we have to provide modern services today: water and sewer, road development, schools and infrastructure, education. They fund the North Slope Borough Department of Education. They fund the Elisaqui College. Anything that is taken for granted, so to speak, for the most part anymore down here in the lower 48, that is fully funded through the development of oil and gas and taxing that infrastructure on the North Slope. So massive amounts of benefit that we've seen over the years from the 1970s when it was, including life expectancy increases of 13 years since 1980 to 2014.
13 years since 1980. That's a big benefit, isn't it?
Huge benefit.
It was said by the BLM person that was here. He said something about we wanted to make sure that those that live in subsistence cultures, that they're able to continue. Do the people you represent want more than subsistence?
I didn't hear the last part of that question, sorry.
Do the people that you represent want more than a subsistence living?
We, in this day and age, with the economy that we've come to appreciate since oil and gas development on the North Slope, we need more than just a subsistence lifestyle, right? The jobs that are provided through these resource development projects enhance the way that we subsist anymore. And so we need that, and they coexist, and you can't separate them anymore.
You know, Mr. Chairman, it's really disappointing to see an administration that says to people that they should, one of our first goals is to make sure that people can have a subsistence living. You just heard right here that they would like a better life. And I think living 13 years longer would qualify as having a better life. Think about the incredible benefit to people as a result of oil. You get to live 13 years longer. You maybe get to see your grandchildren. Amazing. Ms. Zagama, perhaps you answered this in the follow-up with Mr. Stauber, but in regards to cherry-picking data, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
Well, we often hear that industry is leaving this huge cost to the taxpayer, and that's not true. We return $55 for every single dollar BLM spends administering the oil and gas program.
Could I do a real quick follow-up here? So we hear all this about big oil, big problem. As a result of this stuff, are we going to have more smaller producers, those mom and pop operations that sometimes pop up in the oil patch? Are we going to have more of them as a result of these rules and regulations?
Not when you increase all these costs on the small producer. It'll be left to the big guys.
So it's only the big guys that can survive, is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. Ms. Vasquez, is climate change causing increased wildfires?
The scientists who study our atmosphere suggest that greenhouse gas emissions are driving up the temperature of the planet. We see in the western part of this country a long-term drought and aridification that
Sorry about that.
supports forest fires.
Do you ever read any of the scientists, which over 1,000 of them now, what you would call climate scientists, who have said that this is not man-caused? Do you ever read any of them?
I have.
What's
But I
glo-
am not an atmospheric scientist. I want to qualify my answer.
What's global weirding? I saw that in your testimony. What's global weirding?
The problem with climate change is it doesn't cause warming everywhere. It causes changes in our weather and our climate in various ways across the globe, and you see that in the news every day with heavy rains, huge storms, as well as forest fires, even in the tundra and in the boreal forest. There's no question in the mind of scientists, and I am not one of them, who study the atmosphere, that greenhouse gas emissions are driving the climate to warm globally.
So you have 1,000 scientists that are saying, over 1,000 that are saying they disagree with you. You said there's no question this is happening. Sounds like there is a question amongst eminent scientists.
The majority of scientists who study our climate believe that global warming and climate change are caused by human activity.
Are you familiar with Copernicus, the man who said that the world is round?
Thank you, sir. I am.
Do you know that he was excommunicated from the Catholic Church because it was heresy for someone to say that? And he was in a distinct minority at that point. In fact, one of the very few people on Earth that said the Earth was round. Just think if we followed consensus, if Europeans followed consensus at that time.
Yeah, we have a mix of science and religion here that I'm not qualified to comment on.
You've been very generous. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Representative Porter, and we were happy to waive you on, Representative.
Thank you. In 2022, the federal government finally, after 100 years of having the rate unchanged, made oil companies pay a fair and appropriate market rate for onshore drilling. We passed a provision that my microphone's off. I'll start again, and I'd like my time back. In 2022, the federal government, finally, after 100 years unchanged, made oil companies pay a fair and appropriate market rate for onshore drilling. I'm just going to shut, sir. We did this by passing a provision that I wrote in the Inflation Reduction Act that would increase onshore royalty rates, that increased onshore royalty rates to 16 2/3%. Ms. Sagama, you represent the oil and gas industry, and you suggested in your testimony that this change, along with others, this change in the onshore royalty rate will seriously harm the oil industry. How so?
I've got no problem with what Congress actually passed. Congress passed increased royalty rates and increased fees, and so BLM has to put in place a rule that honors that. It's obviously law. What BLM has done has gone beyond what Congress passed in raising bonding amounts 20-fold, in adding additional fees that Congress did not pass, and in increasing cost of living adjustments, which Congress did not pass.
So, Ms. Sigmund, you support the adjustment to 16 2/3%? where you don't contest.
Of course not. It's law.
And I really appreciate that because, of course, many oil-producing states, including places like Texas, charge 20 to 25% to drill on their state land. So Congress is still giving, shorting federal taxpayers and giving oil a very reasonable rate at 16 and 2/3%. I know there are differences between state and federal lands, but I'm glad to hear you say that you think it was appropriate to update the royalty rate. I want to turn to bonding. You talk in your testimony about bankruptcy. And you say that the sales in bankruptcy almost always result in continuous liability for the assets. Why?
I mean, that's the system. We don't want a system where.
That's actually not bankruptcy law. Bankruptcy law allows assets to be sold free and clear, and for the company to discharge the liability.
Right. Another company picks it up. Yeah.
When a new company buys it, they don't pick up the liability.
Yes, they do. Yes, they absolutely do. That's part of the package. When you purchase new assets, you purchase all the liability with it.
That's actually literally not how bankruptcy works.
That's literally how the oil and gas industry works. Those assets are still in a chain of custody. And if, so they're purchased, or if not, the BLM goes after the prior company.
Okay, so if BLM goes after the prior company, just say that the prior company then goes bankrupt and they have to go back in the chain or they weren't sold. How does BLM recover and get the prior company, which went through bankruptcy, and discharge their liability on that past well to pay?
So again, when companies go bankrupt, usually what happens is their assets are purchased by another company. So the chain of custody continues. And
That next company goes bankrupt.
well, I mean, then it's a hypothetical on a hypothetical because there's 37 orphan wells on federal lands. So the chain of custody is working in most cases. So of the 89,000 producible wells in the BLM system, 0.03% are orphaned wells.
So you said earlier you said 297? Are those the idle wells that you were referring to, that number?
In 2019, GAO had a report, and they identified 296 orphan wells on BLM lands.
What changed to go from 296 to 37?
Yeah, it's a good story, right? So the Assistant Secretary just reported back to Congress that there are only 37 orphan wells on BLM lands. So over that time since 2019, BLM has taken proactive measures. They should be applauded for reducing the number of orphan wells. But most of those wells are plugged and abandoned and reclaimed by other companies. So we have a lot of members that when they go in, they want to produce on new leases, they will clean up the orphan wells that are in that area, even if there's.
BLM allowed there to be 300, 297 or whatever.
You know, it's still a very small amount.
Number, I appreciate you.
Well, it's actually the Trump and the Biden administrations have reduced that number. I think it's, well, I think that's a very small amount of orphan wells when you consider the 96,000 wells at the time that that number was identified by GAO. You know, there are some bad actors, and there are ways to deal with bad actors. BLM has the flexibility now to increase bonding amounts for those companies that have shown that they're not as responsible. And so BLM already has that flexibility and has gone after other companies in the chain of command or the chain of custody and have, prior military. And so they have decreased the number of wells that are orphaned. It's a good story.
So then why do you oppose BLM continuing this work on bonding?
Because the numbers show that it's an arbitrary and capricious rule to increase costs so much when the problem is such a relatively small problem.
What is the right number?
The right bonding number, I think the system works today. The system works today. That's why there are only 37 orphan wells on federal lands.
Do you know, you say in your testimony, and I appreciated this, that a good question to ask BLM is how many wells are plugged and abandoned each year without requiring a call on a bond? Do you know how many do require a call on a bond?
Yes. Over the last 10 years, 4 every year require a call on bond. So that's a really small, again, it's a very small number, and it shows that the system in place is working.
Was the bond adequate to fully cover the cost of cleanup in those 4 situations?
I don't know the particulars on those 4. The only number we have is what Tommy Boudreau reported back to Congress, so I don't have any more information than that number.
I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Scamma. Real quick before we go to Representative Boebert, what is the time frame to get a state permit in Texas versus a federal permit?
Probably a matter of days or weeks versus 6 or 10 or 20 months.
Okay, so federal, state permit in Texas, just a couple of days, federal permit, many months.
Right, and that's why the states can command a higher royalty rate, because they don't extract so much money in the regulatory process.
Thank you very much. We're now going to recognize Representative Boebert from Colorado for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Sagama, would you agree that the efficiently approving applications for permits to drill is one way to increase energy production on federal lands and help drive down this skyrocketing inflation that we're seeing in the gas prices? Excuse me.
Absolutely. Certainty in leasing and permitting, it makes a more efficient system so that we can respond to prices faster.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the Biden administration, they've fallen behind on the permitting timelines that have been established previously in the Trump administration. In June of 2019, drilling permit review times averaged 94 days, and by the end of fiscal year 2021, the drilling permit reviews averaged 182 days. So in fiscal year 2022, the BLM had approved an average of 233 drilling permits per month. And in contrast, the Department of the Interior was approving nearly 400 drilling permits monthly in fiscal year 2020 under President Trump. So, Ms. Sagama, you discussed the increased bureaucracy around lease suspensions and permit extensions. What can we do in Congress to ensure that the agencies spend their time reducing the current APD backlog, something that you and I have discussed in the past?
There have been so many good legislative ideas, such as an HR 1 that would improve the process. I don't know that the House can really force the Senate to take that up. So I think you all have done your job in putting forward really good ideas for moving forward.
Certainly laying out the groundwork for future Congresses to work together. But would extending the APD term to 4 years instead of 2 years, as done rather than just justifying quarterly extensions, be part of that solution?
Absolutely. We think, and we're making that comment in our comments on the leasing rule, that BLM should just have a 4-year permit term. It keeps them from having to go back and revisit the permits every 2 years. Just one 4-year permit term. It stopped this cycle of continuing to justify an extension. The reality is we need many permits in hand before we can start, because you don't have any certainty on how long it's going to take BLM to get your permit done. So you can't have your rig come out and you don't have enough permits to keep that rig busy, because we're super efficient in drilling now.
Yes. So My American Energy Act, which you and I have discussed, which passed the House earlier this year under HR 1, that would do exactly what we're talking about here. It would require courts to remand lease sales and these environmental impact statements to agencies to remedy when necessary, rather than just allowing judges with political agendas to simply vacate these leases, and certainly extending the term from 2 years to 4 years. So Ms. Sagama, last month BLM issued a supplemental environmental impact statement to its draft resource management plans of the Colorado River Valley Field Office and the Grand Junction field office in Colorado. This proposed land grab could lock up 1.6 million acres to future oil and gas leasing. This is something that we're continuously fighting in the western slope of Colorado. Can you elaborate on the jobs that will be lost in western Colorado, the negative impacts to hardworking Coloradans, and the loss of education funding and so much more that will result in this?
Unfortunately, we have just begun to look at that RMP because there's just so much regulation coming at us right now, so I don't have an economic analysis on what that will do. I think BLM's estimate of only 600 wells that will be prevented over 20 years is woefully inadequate. I think the intention is to stop the development of the very promising Mancos Shale in the Piceance Basin there in western Colorado, and I think that's very problematic. What I think is especially problematic is they're closing nearly 1.6 million acres under the guise of closing areas that have no known low potential or medium potential for oil and gas. The problem with that is 15 years ago, the Bakken was considered medium potential. 20 years ago, the Permian Basin in New Mexico was considered basically low potential. So now, those are two of the most prolific basins in the world. So by cutting off the Mancos Shale to any new exploration, what was low that could become high potential, we would never know.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask one final question?
Thank you very much. Are you done?
I was asking if I could ask one final question.
Yes, you may.
Thank you,
Yes,
Mr.
you may.
Chairman. So we all saw Joe Biden beg Saudi Arabia to increase their oil production to relieve high gas prices, and then of course he depleted our strategic petroleum reserves to drive down those prices in the name of a midterm election. What threat does begging terrorists for oil rather than producing it right here in America pose to our U.S. national security?
Well, the good news is if we actually developed our oil here in the United States, we make OPEC irrelevant. We could be producing 2 to 3 million more barrels of oil a day. OPEC would then be irrelevant, and global oil prices would be lower, and consumers would be paying less at the pump.
Thank you, Ms. Agama, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me that extra time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Representative Fulcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the panel, thank you for your comments, and please understand that dueling committees, that's why some of us come and go. We got your written testimony, and thank you for that. Question for Ms. Sagama, and this has to do with royalty rates. But while the federal royalty rate has gone up, it's also the case that the environmental assessment has more robust emission impact analysis than in other prior leases. Should we expect that we're going to get much out of all this?
What do you mean much
on the royalty increase and versus the overall emission impact, more robust emission impact?
Well, I mean, definitely royalties will be higher based on the new royalty rate. I'm not sure I'm understanding you're tying it to emissions.
This might be my microphone, Mr. Chairman. I'm not. Sorry for the technical difficulty. Hopefully this will be a little bit better. Statement, and then a question, Ms. Agama. If you can speak to this, FERC has been extremely slow in approving new gas and oil pipelines. For example, a GTN Express out of Canada that goes through Idaho and into Oregon and Washington is still under delay. All they want to do is increase the capacity to compress LNG to run more through an existing pipe. FERC commissioners are clashing with each other over new mandates on social impacts in states from greenhouse gases and other emissions. This is causing delays on even things like upgrading the compression software for LNG going through an existing pipeline. This upgrade got a clean bill of health in its environmental review. Half the LNG would go to my state of Idaho. I'm hearing a lot of talk from these agencies, but not a lot of production. What's the best way to get action on this?
I mean, I think if we approved, if the administration approved pipelines and gas gathering lines and the like, we would be able to produce more natural gas. And natural gas has been the #1 reason the United States has reduced more greenhouse gases emissions than any other country, is by increased use of natural gas in electricity generation. So natural gas offers that climate change benefit. We've done more than wind and solar combined as far as reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the electricity sector. So I think sometimes when FERC is slow to approve things, they're actually, it's worse for the environment.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, just for the record, we're doing some homework on this, and I just want to point out and enter into the record that our exports of crude in this country in the last 2 years are down 57.6%, if I understand that correctly. On average, about 4.9 million barrels per day down, just within that, that 2-year window. And so I think that underscores the importance of natural gas. I think that underscores the importance of some of these approvals. And with that, and overcoming the technical difficulties, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Representative Hageman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of the witnesses for participating today. President Biden and Democrats in Congress continue to push the false narrative that there are leases available out there that oil and gas companies are just choosing not to use. President Biden said that there were 9,000 unused permits available that could be accessed at any time. This false number was abused by the Democrats until they realized they couldn't defend it anymore, and they began to use the 6,000 number. When Director Stone Manning from the BLM was here a few months ago, she kept referring to a statistic of some 6,000 or so unused oil and gas leases, suggesting the BLM and Department of Interior had done their part, and that it was up to these companies to do theirs by using these old leases without issuing any new ones. Commissioner Novotny, can you dispel this myth for us? Explain where the idea came from and why it is so important that we are able to continue to lease.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hageman, I really appreciate this question. And as this administration has rallied about this ever-changing number, the honest fact is it's just not 9,000. The facts are that in Wyoming, many of these approved permits are unable to be developed because they are on leases that are being litigated by environmental groups. We're talking about millions of acres of litigated leases. In other cases, operators may only have one approved permit, but would like to pad drill, and that's several more wells at a time. And pad drilling specifically means drilling more than one well off of that footprint. And instead of spending millions of dollars to move a drilling rig, you can save costs and produce a greater area. It's just good business practice. Not being able to pad drill can severely harm the economies of a drilling program, which brings up a larger point. The number of approved federal permits at any given time is only a small portion of the bigger development picture. Companies have to balance what they believe is the productivity of the quality of the rock with those commodity prices, because let's face it, oil and gas, these are commodities. They're sending out what we call authorities for expenditure to find those investors to determine how much of that $10 million that it could be needed to pay up front to produce that. And they are securing surface wells, surface use agreements, access agreements for those pads in those locations, and securing rights of way for transmission lines, pipelines, and others. They are negotiating gas agreements and multi-million-dollar contracts with rig operators. They are determining whether the summer drilling program will be a single well or 50 or 500. They are juggling wildlife stipulations, especially as you and I know in the state of Wyoming with sage grouse, plus seasons and weather. They are juggling thousands of factors to determine when and where they're going to drill. According to the BLM, in April there were 6,443 approved and 4,851 pending. In April, there were 1,972 approved permits and 496 pending permits in Wyoming. And today, we only have 20 active drilling rigs.
Okay. Well, I appreciate those statistics and that information. You also have highlighted that just how significant a single well has on your county, citing up to $400,000 in tax revenue in a single year. This tells us either that the Biden administration is unaware of how significant oil and gas is to our state, or they simply don't care. In your opinion, why does this administration insist on exporting our economy and our jobs to other nations that do something that we can do better?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I have no explanation for the decision of this administration to be so anti-oil and gas. These are good-paying jobs in the trade industry, jobs that my grandfather was able to enjoy and send his kids, the first in his family, to go to college. These are wonderful jobs that produce the revenue and the resources that fund our American economy.
And I appreciate that as well. Deputy Director Ned deflected from answering my questions regarding how this administration's policies have created serious energy poverty and the fact that their favored unreliable energy resources rely on child labor in places like the Congo, by claiming that he didn't know what I was talking about or hadn't researched it or hadn't looked into it. Don't you agree that the BLM, in pursuing these radical policies, should make even a rudimentary effort to get an understanding of the consequences of their decisions?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hageman, absolutely. My constituents are facing a 30% rate increase on their energy production when we are retiring perfectly good coal and gas-fired power plants within the state of Wyoming and across this country. As we wait for that next-gen nuclear facility to be built near Kimmer, Wyoming, we are stifling our economy. We are taxing our folks directly and indirectly through inflation and regulation out of house and home and their ability to sustain themselves. Oil and gas leads the way, and we can do it domestically appropriately that protects the environment, protects wildlife, and ensures for future generations that we are a successful nation.
Seems like that this administration has a different agenda in mind. Thank you, Mr. Novotny. Thank you to all of our witnesses. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. And so to the witnesses, once in a while, the chairperson will ask for a second round of questioning, and I'm going to take the prerogative to give everyone an opportunity for another round. I've got some more questions, just a few actually, from my perspective that I'd like to move forward. So I'll recognize myself for this next round. Ms. Sagama, Dr. Vasquez says in her testimony that the BLM has failed to manage their onshore oil and gas program by failing to increase the bonding levels. But as you note in your testimony, there are currently only 37 orphan wells on federal lands. Doesn't that number actually prove that bonding rates for production on federal lands is actually adequate?
I agree. I think the system is working. Industry's made a concerted effort to help get those numbers down. We are the ones who are reclaiming most of those wells, even if we are not the responsible company. As I mentioned, companies come in, they want to develop in a new area, and they do plug and abandon those existing wells.
So by increasing bonding and greatly increasing other fees unnecessarily through their recent regulation, is the BLM running the risk of creating more orphan wells by putting small operators out of business?
I think so. I think that if as written, these rules go through, they would put more wells at risk of being orphaned. You know, the idea of a surety market, bonding, is not to lock up all the capital in a bond, because if you do, then you don't have those resources available to actually do the plugging and abandoning work and the reclamation work.
So one could argue that this new regulation is environmentally and financially irresponsible.
I would say so, and it's arbitrary and capricious looking at the numbers.
Mr. Novotny, Ms. Vasquez says in her testimony that the new leasing regulations will not impact smaller operators. Do you agree with that perspective?
Mr. Chairman, under a definition by the Small Business Administration, 111 companies that produce oil and gas in Wyoming are small businesses. This change in bonding is going to increase from 2.5 million to 57 million in annual interest payments. That's not sustainable for a business practice. It's going to kill jobs in my community, communities across Wyoming. It's going to disrupt those traditional revenue streams that we rely on, and it's also going to harm our nation's energy security. And Mr. Chair, if I can just have a little progress, I would like to address the Rock Springs RMP that was originally mentioned by the BLM. It took 12 years for that document to be released. There are 4 different counties with 4 different sets of commissioners. That's 3 terms of their livelihood if you were there from the beginning to the end. This is, we take our cooperating agency status under NEPA very, very seriously. We work hard with our federal partners, but when our federal partners will not work fairly and follow the laws, follow NEPA and practices, it impacts our jobs, our recreation, and every component of our state's economy.
We want them to follow the facts, the science, and the truth, not political science. And I will share with you that the disgust that our friends in Alaska have experienced these last couple of weeks, and actually for the last 2.5 years, because this administration, I believe it's 55 plus projects now they've shut down in the great state of Alaska, and has devastated many parts of that state and the economy. They've done it in Minnesota with banning mining in northeastern Minnesota. For those of you who don't know, northeastern Minnesota mines the taconite that makes over 80% of this nation's steel. And this administration, in the biggest copper nickel find in the world, took off 225,000 acres when we need those minerals for our everyday lives and to move forward. I will, since Representative Falcher is still here, I will give you the opportunity for a second set of questions for 5.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's it for me. Thank you. You're back.
Thank you very much. So to the witnesses, thank you for your expert testimony. And we greatly appreciate the information that you shared with us. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on Friday, September 22nd. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. And I will be submitting for the record some record of submissions from many groups that are concerned with what happened with the regulations from the BLM. So if there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.